Hello, we are going to work on getting our vest cut out from our fabric today. The last video I went over patterns and what the patterns looked like and getting them all set and prepped, etc. for us. And I'm going to show you how to work with the tissue paper pattern, but what I've done is I've actually traced all the pieces that I need onto poster board, and I'm going to be using this piece because I think it's going to be easier for you to see some of the marks than it is for you to see on the tissue paper. So the first thing we're going to have to do is let's talk about the tools that we're going to need. So in order to cut and prep your pattern, you're going to need obviously your fabric. For this garment, we need a fashion fabric, which for me is this one, and we need a lining, which for me is this one, and we need interfacing. So this is our fabric that we need. I have my vest buckle. I've not yet picked out my buttons, but I can do that at a later time. So the only other thing I need is thread and buttons, and this is my fabric and my notions. So I'll put these to the side for now. You're also going to need something to cut with. You can use your shears. Remember, the shears have the bent handle so that they ride flat along the table. You also can use a rotary cutter. So this looks like a really fancy pizza cutter. Every single rotary cutter has some type of guard on it. This one, it just slides out of the way. You can kind of see the black edge when it's in place. Kind of goes over the edge so you don't hit the blade, because these are very, very sharp and you don't want to leave them just lying around. So anytime, if you're using a rotary cutter, anytime that cutter is not in your hand, the guard had better be on, okay? And different ones have different types of guards. Some of them will wrap around from the outside. Some you might slide on. Like I said, this one, which is my preferred one, it just slides out of the way. And they come in varying sizes. This is one of the larger ones. The larger ones are great if you've got large pieces and a lot of straight lines. If you have a lot of intricate shapes or curves, then you might want a smaller cutter so that you can navigate those curves a little more. The other thing you need to know about using a rotary cutter is you cannot use it on just any surface. You need to have a cutting mat, and usually preferably a self-healing mat. Because when you're using this blade, right, and you are cutting it along, and I mean this one I need to be replaced. It's not as sharp as it could, but you just cut, so it's just kind of cuts pretty cleanly. But if I was doing this on the regular table, if it was wood, it'd scratch right into the wood. This is a fabric covered table to cut straight through that fabric. So rotary cutters, you have to have the guard up when it's not in use, and you have to have a cutting mat. So those are the things to know about rotary cutters. Also, smaller sizes are better for navigating more intricate shapes. And like I said, we're going to be using shears today, but I just wanted to let you know a little bit about the rotary cutter itself. Alright, so our shears. You're also going to need some way to secure your pattern in place. For the tissue paper pattern, I would use pins. Since I'm going to be using and you could use this for either one, but with the poster board, I'm not going to pin through that. So what I'm actually going to use is going to be pattern weights. So these ones kind of look like little bean bags. They've got little metal balls in them, and these will just hold my pattern in place while I'm using it, because when you're cutting your pattern out, you do not want your fabric or your pattern to shift, because if it does, then you're going to not be cutting true, and then you're going to have problems when you're making your garment. You're going to need access to a tape measure or some type of measuring device. It could be a ruler, but what we're going to need to do is we're going to be using this to make sure our grain lines are parallel wherever we need them, and you will have used your tape measure to measure your individual that you're making the vest for, and so on and so forth. You're also going to need some type of marking tools, okay? I'm going to be using primarily tracing paper. So they make mostly chalk paper now. But this is a paper where one side is colored and the other side is not. And the colored side, this is wax tracing paper. Most of everything you can find nowadays is chalk tracing paper. But this transfers marks onto your fabric. So any mark that's on my pattern that needs to be on my fabric, I can take my tracing paper and my tracing wheel, and you can see it's got little, it's kind of like a pointy pizza cutter. So what we'll do is we'll run the tracing wheel along the tracing paper or along the marks with the colored side next to the fabric where we want the image to transfer to. So I'll be using that for a number of the marks that I need to make. You can also use, now when you're going through the pattern, you really want to use tracing paper, but if something near the edge of the pattern, you could use Taylor's chalk or Taylor's wax. These are some used pieces. They're usually pretty square and pretty sharp when you get them to start with. You also may want to use a marking pen. This is the one that I referenced when we were talking about supplies earlier in the semester. The blue side can be washed off with water. The purple side will disappear from the fabric sometime within 24 hours. Some fabrics it'll disappear within the hour, some it might stay on a few days. There are some fabrics where even though it's designed to disappear, it won't come out. So it is important when you're using any type of marking pen or pencil that you anticipate washing out or fading away. It is important that you test that to make sure that it does go away when and how you want. Okay, so these are the basic things that we're going to need access to for cutting our pattern. I also have my reading glasses, and I also have a little hand support because my hands get tired because I've been doing this for a while. So I'll put that on. Okay. Another tool I wanted to show you, which we won't really use in this one, you've heard me reference a couple times pinking shears. So if we look at the inside of this blade, and you probably have seen these in scrapbooking aisles and things like that, but it's not a clean blade. We've got these little triangular shapes on there, and what happens is when we cut fabric with these, we get this little kind of jagged edge, right? So that's one of the ways that if you don't have a serger or some other way to keep your seam allowance from raveling, you can cut with pinking shears, just to kind of, and often we do that as a secondary step to trim that away. So if you aren't going to be serging your side seams, you look at pinking shears, or like I said, we might zigzag that edge. So I just wanted to kind of bring those to your attention. All right, so these are the tools we need. We don't need all of them at this moment. So I'm going to put those to the side. All right. So as we referenced we looked at our pattern to see what our cutting layout is. I don't want to jumble up the screen with too much, so you guys can reference that when you're putting out your fabric. Now this is as I said, this is my fabric, my fashion fabric. I have a little bit more than it says to get, but it's better to have more than not enough, okay? So when we're talking about prepping our fabric, again, if you wanted to pre-wash this, you could. When you are buying fabric, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about fabrics, right? On the end of the bolt of fabric, it gives you a lot of information about what kind of material it's made from, what the washing instructions are, so on and so forth. So if you wanted to pre-wash your fabric, you would do it according to what the bolt is telling you to do. And if it doesn't have washing instructions, you go by the type of fabric and treat it that way, okay? We've talked a lot about the selvage edge, correct? So The selvage edge is our factory finished edge. Most of the time that's a nice clean edge. Sometimes it'll have printing on it, but it usually has a different, slightly different look and feel than the rest of the fabric. Our cut edge is where it's been cut off the bolt. Okay, so when we fold our fabric to cut it, we're going to match our selvages and fold this the long way. You can fold it with right sides out or right sides in. I prefer to fold it with right sides together. So I'm just going to flip this over. And this does have a pattern, but it's not directional. But the pattern layout for this doesn't really matter anyway, because it lays it out whether it's got a directional consideration or not. Now you want your fabric to be as flat as you can. That's why it's nice to have, access to the cutting table. When I'm at home, I often will do this on the dining room table. It's a little lower, so you have to bend down a little bit more, so it's not as good for your back. But I'm less concerned. You see my cut edge here isn't matching up exactly. You're much more concerned with getting your selvage edge to match than you are with getting that cut edge. Okay, so you want that selvage edge to be laying exactly right on top of each other. You just kind of smooth that out. And since most of you are probably going to be using the tissue pattern, we do have the poster board pattern in all of the sizes, so if you wanted to come in and use that for cutting, you are more than welcome to. But we'll start out with the paper pattern, which, as you saw, moving my fabric around made it blow away. Haha, I am back. All right. So, when we are placing our fabric placing our pattern piece on the fabric, like I said, the grain line is our key to how this gets placed, okay? That grain line needs to be parallel with our selvage. Our fold is also parallel, so you can measure either from your fold in or from the selvage in. But what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take my tape measure. I'm going to take one of my pins. Now if you have a cutting table that you can pin into, you can just pin straight down so you've got a pivot point. But if you don't, then you can just take a little bit of fabric and just pin one end. And now we're going to measure this grain line. From the grain line, I'm measuring to the fold, and that's 3.5 inches. Now in order to make sure this is parallel, I'm going to go to the other end, and it's just a little more than 3.5, so I'm just going to adjust it until this end is also 3.5 inches away from my selvage or my fold. And then I'll put a pin there. Okay, so now I know that my pattern piece is properly lined up. So the next step is to just make sure my pattern piece is nice and flat. And I'm just going to pin. I like to start at my corners, and then I'll come back and stitch along and pin along the lines. And for this pattern, I'm making the extra large, right? So that's the smallest one in this size grouping. So I'm going to make sure my pins stay inside the lines of that one. If I was pinning the extra large, I'd pin in this area close to that cutting line. The 3X, I'd come out here, okay? Now when pinning on this table, I have to be careful because since it is a fabric covered table, it is easy to accidentally pin your piece to the fabric on the table, and you are going to have to kind of lift it a little bit to get your shears under there. So you don't want to pin it to the table. And again, you want to get a nice true cut. You do want to make sure you're going through both layers of the fabric. But you want to make sure that pattern piece is as flat as possible so you get the truest cut possible. Now from here, if I wanted to preserve my pattern piece and not cut through it, and you see I have several different colors of tracing paper here, you want the color that you're going to be able to see but is not the most obvious. Like, you don't want the greatest contrast, you want kind of the medium contrast. So this is the wrong side of my fabric, so that's the side I'd want to mark on. So the color part of the wax paper or tracing paper would go against that fabric, and I'd come in here and I'd make sure I got my tracing paper under the line that I wanted to trace. All right, so what I can do is I can just trace my entire pattern piece onto the fabric. Don't forget your notches. I like to do just a little line. You can actually trace the triangle. But you can trace this entire piece, and then you could take the pattern piece away and you've preserved this piece with all the sizes. So then if you want to make another size later, you can do that. And I would do that the whole way around, and then I'd have my line that I could go back in and cut along. Now, I've got some extras of these patterns, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this pattern out with the tissue paper so you can see that process. Some people like to cut their pattern piece out exactly on their completed line before they pin it to their fabric, and that's absolutely fine. Some people do that because they want to use they want to use paper cutting shears or scissors for the tissue. I find that the tissue is thin enough that it doesn't hurt the fabric shears. But some people just like that neatness, so you know exactly where the boundaries are, exactly where to place everything, so you can cut it out. Now, one of the other things that I like to do is, well, first of all, I'm supposed to read things. Now, I've actually already done this wrong, and it's a good thing that I looked at it before I cut it out, because I don't know if you can read it or not, but this says piece 6 and it says front lining. So I've actually pinned my lining piece to my fashion fabric, and that is not going to work. So you've seen how that gets pinned. So now we're going to unpin it. See, everybody makes mistakes, don't they? All right, since I have my fabric prepped, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this aside, and I'll come back to this when we cut the lining. Because I forgot to go over that step with you too. So we gather all our tools, we make sure we have all our fabric, and then we've got to go through our pattern pieces. All right? Like I said, this is just what we've done here, with the exception of these two pieces, is we have simply just traced each size on to the poster board. All right, so these are the exact same pattern pieces, the same sizes that you'll find in the tissue. They've just been transferred to the paper. So instead of pinning this to the paper, I'm just going to hold these in place and cut them out. So I'm going to look at each piece, and this one says cut 2 of lining, so I'm going to set that aside. This says vest front lining, which was the piece I just tried to cut out. So that's also going to be set aside because that's for lining. Vest back, cut 2 of lining. So that goes with our next set as well. The vest front facing says cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. So I need this for my fashion fabric. And then vest front, cut 2 of fabric. So this one also goes with my fashion fabric. And then you'll have a welt from the pattern from the McCall's pattern, and it'll say it'll be cut 2 of fabric for the welt. And if you are going to do the actual pockets, then there's a different welt, which is this one here, and then there will also be a pocket lining, so that will be cut out of the lining. Okay, so you'll have 3, regardless of if you're making the real pockets or not, you'll have 3 pieces to cut out of the lining. Those are pieces 1, 5, and 2, which is the vest front facing, and your welt. So again, these will lay on your fabric exactly the same way, right? Now, as I said, instead of pinning through this, since it's much thicker, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to use my pattern weights to hold it in place. So I'm going to do the same thing with my selvage edge. I'm going to measure one end, and that is, let's put it this way, right at 13 inches away from my edge. Now I need to come down to this end. That one's a little more than 13, so I want to keep this one in place and just pivot until I get that line exactly 13 inches away as well. So then I'll put my pattern weight here to hold that in place. And people use all kinds of things as pattern weights. I mean, I can use this. I could use my shears. Basically, you just want to hold your piece in place so that you can mark it. Now I'm going to trace around this. I'm going to use the disappearing ink pen. And I'm just going to trace around everything. Now, one of the things that's different about using the poster board part is on the tissue paper, we have the dart on the tissue paper right there that we'll just trace through onto the fabric, okay? And I'll show you how to do that when we get to that point. In the poster board one, we've gone ahead and cut that out so you can trace that instead of having to use your tracing wheel to trace through it. You just have to remember that you aren't going to come in and cut that out of the fabric, okay? And I'm trying to be nice and precise and trace exactly along these lines. So I'm being cautious and intentional, because again, the truer and cleaner we can be with our cutting, the better results we're going to have. Now some of these pieces need to be traced through, so I'm going to move my weights so I can access that. So this is our mark if you're going to make a real pocket. If you're just going to do the welt pocket, then you'll use the mark that's on the tissue paper. I'm going to use the yellow. I've already traced my dart there, so I don't have to trace that again. But I do need to trace my welt mark. And you want to be fairly firm with your tracing wheel so you can really get those marks to transfer. Now, because I'm just cutting this from the full fabric, I'm not accessing both sides, and both sides will need to be marked. So once I've got this cut out, I'm going to have to do this again, but I'll do it with the fabric underneath so that I can get it on the other side. And it's always good to check to make sure that it's transferred through before you move on to your next step. Now this is our center front line and our buttons, our button placement. So that's another piece to trace. If you're working with these patterns, everything you need to trace has been outlined in red. The places you need to cut are in black. We shifted a little. Okay. So I've traced the pieces I need to trace. I've done my outline. Pull this away. And now I have my pattern piece, which you may not be able to see from this distance, but my pattern piece is now traced onto my fabric, okay? Now before I cut this, oh, I'm sorry, I was trying to figure out where the other line came from. That's from when I was tracing from the incorrect pattern piece. All right, anyway, before you cut this, if you're just tracing your pattern, if you're tracing it through the tissue paper or using the poster board, you're going to want to pin your two layers together before you cut them. This is just going to help make sure that the layers come out the same. All right. I just have a little tray of pins. You may have a pin cushion. You may have a pin magnet. It doesn't matter how you keep your pins organized, just as long as they're handy. And I'm making sure that I'm pinning inside the lines and not crossing the lines, because when I go to cut this out, if I have a pin that's sticking out past the line, then I may catch that with my shears, and that's going to put a nick in your blade, and that makes things not cut very well in the future. All right, now I've got those together. Another thing that I like to do is I prefer not to cut anything out until I have all of my pattern pieces laid out. That way I know that I have enough fabric. I did get extra fabric, so I already know I have enough, but just as a matter of practice, I tend to make sure get all of my pieces laid out before I cut any of my pieces. All right, so I'm going to put, and this might be a little different than the cutting layout that's in the instructions, but as long as you're paying attention to grain line, and as long as you are keeping all the tops oriented the same way, then it's going to be fine one way or the other, either however you lay it out on the fabric. They're just doing their basic recommendations. All right, this is 2 1/4 inches from the edge on that one. I'm at 2 1/4 here. All right, so this is my welt. Get this traced. Okay, now one of the things about the welt is that if you look closely at that edge, it says 3/8 SA. That means that on those edges, instead of a 5/8 seam allowance, it's 3/8. So you can try to remember that, or if you wanted, you could draw yourself a little stitching line on your pattern piece. So if I take my ruler, and you could do this with your tape measure if that's what you've got handy, you're just measuring in 3/8 of an inch from the edge. Or that stitching line is actually on the pattern piece, so if you wanted, you could trace it with your tracing paper. right, so there's my welt. And now I need to cut my facing. Now it would be one of the reasons I don't pay attention to the cutting layouts as much is because one of the things I've kind of trained myself to do is to conserve fabric. So you want to use as little fabric as possible while still making sure you get your pattern pieces cut out correctly. One of the things to remember is then when I've got a narrow piece like this, I should cut it close to my selvage edge and not close to my fold. Because if I cut it over here and I go to open up the fabric, there's a giant hole literally in the middle of the fabric. But if I cut it by the edge, then I've got this whole piece, twice this amount, available if I want to use it for something else. Okay? All right, so I'm going to start there. All right, that's 6 inches. And 6 inches, I have that laid out pretty much perfectly. And the advantage of having the tissue piece that you pin down is that it's not going to shift on you while you're tracing. That's another thing you need to be careful of if you are tracing, that you don't push on that edge so much that you end up shifting your pattern piece. It's a fine balance of being firm and yet delicate. Now, I'm setting the pieces that I've used and don't need anymore off to the side. I will need to cut the interfacing with this one, so I'm going to put it over here so I know I'm not done with it. All right, my other 2 pieces, I now need to pin those. Again, making sure that I'm not pinning into the fabric of the table, but making sure I am pinning both layers and making sure that I'm keeping my pins inside my cutting line so I don't nick my shears. Now it's very exciting. It is kind of, there's going to be different points in this project where it will kind of get exciting because you're going to start to see it coming together, and then you'll realize that you did it, and it's a really great process to kind of see and feel that happen. All right, so I have all my pieces on. I have my layers pinned together, and now I'm ready to cut. And remember, we want to be very conscientious and careful and precise with our cutting, because cutting is where that's the point of no return as far as mistakes go. Now, this piece is close to my folded edge, so I'm going to be using that whole piece anyway, so I'm going to start from this edge. When I get to this one, I'm going to start from the other side again so I don't get rid of all that extra fabric. And just take your time and cut as precisely on that line as you possibly can. And one of the things I want you to notice that I'm doing is I'm not lifting my pattern up and cutting like this, right? You want to keep your fabric as flat as you can as you're cutting, because that's going to help it be more precise and shift less. Because fabric shifting at this point is what makes the sides uneven and will lead to an undesirable result when we're going to make the vest. If you are left-handed, you do need to invest in some left-handed shears, because it makes all the difference in the world because when you're cutting a fair amount, having shears that aren't made for you and that are uncomfortable is not going to be good, okay? Or if you're left-handed, you might want to use the rotary cutter, because it's pretty, you can kind of use it on either side much more easily. All right, that's one piece. Now, I did bring this toward me, but I am still keeping it flat on the table. And when they're pinned together, you can move them around so you can access the sides better. Get an angle that works for you. There's all kinds of shears out there. This is just I think these are a Fiskars, which is a brand. They're just nice and fresh. They're fairly new, and they're, used to my hand. When multiple people use shears, they dull different parts of the blade, so they get duller faster. All right, now this piece I want to approach from that side, so I can either walk to the other side of the table, or I can just pull this a little more closer. I can pull this closer to me so I can access it. Make sure I put these out of the way so I don't accidentally cut them if they're underneath what I'm cutting now. Okay, now that I've got that piece cut off of there, I can put my extra away. Again, kind of cleaning and straightening as you go helps you in the long run. And there's not a whole lot of fabric left over, but there's enough that I could actually make another vest from it, or something small. But these little pieces that are around here, these scraps, I can't really do much with. Unless you're doing a crazy quilt, and then you just get a whole bunch of pieces of fabric that are whatever shape and look like whatever, and you put them together to make a big old quilt. All right, I have cut my fashion fabric pieces out. Now what I need to do is those marks that are on the top side, on the top piece need to be transferred to the bottom piece. Now, like I said, I don't want to cut my notches out. So there's 2 notches on this piece. We got one down there, we got one up here. And you can just cut those little triangles out if that's the way that you want to do it. I prefer to mark them. So I'm just going to put the colored side on the unmarked side, the colored side of my wax paper. Get my tracing wheel. Mark those. All right, now so that's now marked. I'm going to mark my stitching lines for my 3/8 seams. Right, so I've got the blue seams on that side. On this side I've got them in yellow. Okay. And for this guy, I need to mark my welt. I need to transfer my dart. transfer my center front line with my buttonhole markings. And I want to transfer all my notches. Oh look, I found a cutting line I missed. Done. All right, so now I have cut and marked all of my fashion fabric pieces. So next we'll move on to the lining, which I tried to do earlier, except not really. All right, I'll take my fabric and I'll put it back in my basket and get my lining fabric out. Now I've gone with a cotton lining. You may have chosen a lining fabric for yourself. And what I'm gonna do, now that piece was 45 inches wide, this piece is 60 inches wide, so it's much wider fabric. So that would mean that in theory, I could get more pieces across. But I'm gonna have to cut those two backs on the fold, right? All right, so I've already folded this with my selvages together, okay? This one actually got cut a little bit on the selvage because I'm using some scrap fabric, but I know that if it's together at the selvage up to there, I just kind of retain that as it goes down. This in on the way along. Okay. So here are my lining pieces that all need to be cut out of this fabric. I'm going to start with my vest back because this is the one I've got to cut twice. All right. So one of the things that you see on the pattern in the tissue paper pattern is when I'm making my own patterns, when I don't have a grain line because I'm on the fold, I will draw this line and it turns the corner and points to the edge. That symbol means that that edge goes on the fold, okay, as opposed to there being a traditional grain line. The tissue pattern piece just says place on fold next to this line. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. All right. So you just got to read your pattern. All right. So this is, it's my back. It says cut 2 of lining, and this edge gets cut on the fold. So I know that if this is on the fold, that when I lay this down, this is actually only one piece. So that's why I know I have to lay it out twice. So I know that I can cut the second piece. I'm going to keep my orientation this way. It doesn't really matter. You can keep it. You know what? I'll make it that way so that we can see what's happening. Okay. So when it says to cut on fold, right? We don't want this a little bit away from the fold. That means that this edge needs to line up exactly on the fold. If you come past the fold this way, then you're making this piece smaller. But if you have it in from the edge, you're actually making this piece bigger, okay? So in order to make sure your measurements are correct, if it says to place it on the fold, it goes exactly on that fold. Beep, beep, beep. Beep. Oh no, I'm missing one. Oh, looky there. It will turn up. Okay. So once again, I'm going to trace around here. And on this pattern piece, since this is the center back where the fold is, so this is our neck edge, that means this is our shoulder, so this is our armhole, and then our side seam. I don't have to trace my back because it's on the fold. I do have to trace my dart. Everything on this piece. All right. Now, the sewing layout in the pattern, it's pretty much rated for. It's laid out as if it's the 45-inch wide, and you could do that, and you could do it either way if it's the 40 or the 60. So it kind of has this piece here, and then the vest piece further down. If you've got a nice wide piece of fabric, this can go next to this, so you don't have to shift it down, okay? However, this piece has to be on the fold, right? So I'm just going to slide this down, and you could flip it over because this doesn't have direction. But again, if I am trying to maintain directionality, if I have directional fabric, then you make sure, because this is the shoulder seam on this one, so you make sure those are facing the same end of the fabric. I'm going to have to shift my fabric before I trace this piece. So in order to retain the integrity of this, I'm going to actually I'm going to trace these two. But actually, we're not going to trace this one because we're going to use the tissue paper for that one. So let me put this poster board piece aside. I'm going to go ahead and pin this one so that we don't get any shifting. And even though my fold is essentially together, again, we want to keep everything as flat as possible, so I'll still put pins in that side. And again, you see how I'm trying very hard to keep my fabric as flat to the table as possible. I'm not lifting it up to put the pins in. You put the pin down and you kind of lift the fabric a little bit and angle the pin back up to come back through. Alright, so now that guy's pinned in place. So now let me get my lining piece. Now I know I'm using the smallest pattern, so this is the line I have to worry about. I want to make sure it doesn't overlap that line I just traced, and this is close without going over. Again, since it's a tissue pattern, I'm just going to pin one end of my grain line. The nice thing about having a tape measure for this step instead of a ruler is that you can go farther. You know, it's a 60-inch tape measure. All right, so from that line to my fold is 23 3/4 inches. So I'll come down to this one end of the line. Not quite, gotta shift a little. Too much. Perfect. Okay, so now, just like I did before, I'm pinning the pattern piece to the fabric. making sure I get through both layers of fabric. Keeping my pins inside the cutting line. And whereas with the poster board piece, I would trace all the pieces before I started cutting anything, with the tissue paper, I would just have all of the tissue paper pieces pinned in place before I started cutting. It's just a really good practice. Okay. All right, now you're pinned in place. I can fit my welt in between here. Not my welt, well, it's the pocket lining, it's not the welt, I'm sorry. 14 3/4, 14 3/4. So another little thing that it's in my way. I'm just gonna cut it out of the way. Another thing that you're going to see written on the poster board patterns is this little notation that says WSA. What that means is with seam allowance. So if I'm creating my own pattern from scratch, I always make my pattern pieces without seam allowance, because that way when I'm tracing out the pieces, that way I automatically have a stitching line for my stitcher, which I think is a more precise way to sew, is to provide stitching lines. And it also gives me the freedom then to have whatever size seam allowance I want in the event, and with that whole idea of alterability, right? So if I need that to be a bigger, deeper seam allowance, I'm able to do that because I just add however much seam allowance I want. All right, so for this pocket lining, we have to trace this little shape again. So if you'll notice, it's a very similar shape to what was on the front of the front fabric piece, but that one was split by the dart. But once that dart is stitched together, it's going to be the same shape here, okay? And that's going to be the opening of the pocket. So again, we're going to pin it. And the weights are good for holding the pattern pieces in place. They are not good for cutting because there's too much shifting going on. All right, I need to put my belt piece on. And what I'm going to do is, now that I've gotten these pieces together, slide my fabric. Oh, ha ha ha! I pinned it to the table. How many places? Oh, got another one. There we go. All right. We'll slide this down some so that we can get our second vest piece traced. Get that fabric back flat. Make sure I'm not overlapping the original piece. Get my fold line exactly on the fold line. And now I will come back and trace it. Done with that. Pin this guy in place. Then we'll get our belt laid out and then we can cut our lining pieces. When I've got this dart traced like this, in order to remind myself not to cut across it, I will very often make sure I put a pin intentionally across that line I've drawn just to help remind myself that don't cut here, because even if I did, I'd run into a pin and that would be bad. Alright, my last piece out of the lining is my belt. Got a little bitty grain line. It's 22. Now this one is also seam allowance 3/8, and it's seam allowance 3/8 around the entire belt. Now, remember how I said that I would provide you with the belt buckle? The belt buckle I have, the vest belt buckle, is this guy. And it's not quite 1 inch. If you sew this at 3/8 of an inch, it will be an inch wide belt, so it'll kind of bunch on this one. So I've learned that if we actually stitch at 5/8, it would fit this vest buckle. If you're going to buy a 1 inch buckle, then you do need to do the 3/8 on the vest belt. But either way, the other ends are 3/8. So I will mark the short ends that way. And yeah, I did a dashed line on the other one, which you can do so that you're differentiating between the cutting and stitching lines. I'm not sure why I just did a straight line on this one instead. I just did. But it usually is better to draw a dashed line so that you'll remember that that's not a cutting line, that that's something different. Okay, so now I have all of my lining pieces laid out, pinned together, and now it's time to cut these pieces. Now the piece that's on the fold, we do not cut the part that's on the fold. We're just cutting the rest of it. So if our mantra for sewing is sew, clip, press, then our mantra for cutting is going to be, let's see, trace, pin, trace, pin, cut, mark. Or if you're not tracing, it can be place. Trace or place, cut, pin, cut, mark. I think my fabric, which was originally stretched pretty tight, has started to relax. So it's a little looser, so I'm catching it a little more. So the reason why there's fabric covering this table is because typically cutting tables, you're going to want a firm surface, but you're going to want what we call a pinnable surface. Something you can actually stick pins directly into, unlike a solid, like, wooden or laminate top. So one of the things there's several materials that those often are. Sometimes they're cork, but cork can be very expensive, like a cork board. And you have different grades. Some are softer, some are harder than others. Sometimes what this is it's called something called Hemisot, which is a construction material that, again, is it's either used for drop ceilings or for siding. I can't remember which. But that's good because it comes in nice big sheets and you can get that laid out on your table. So basically you get a firm yet pinnable surface, and then what we usually do is cover it with fabric so that if the top, we don't want that particular material exposed because it's often a little bit pricey. It's also easy to kind of damage it. I mean, not easy, but you want to avoid damaging it if you can. So when you put stretched fabric over it, then any issues or damage often happens to the fabric, and then you can just replace the fabric, which is usually much cheaper and much easier to replace than that solid surface. Just a little tidbit about cutting tables. You also want your cutting tables to be fairly high. I know that you can't really see me very much, but the cutting table is right about at my waist, so that I don't have to bend down too far to access the fabric and the material, because the more you have to bend over, the more stress that puts on your back, and it's just kind of better and healthier for you as an individual to have that higher cutting table. But that's going to vary. Waist high is different on different people. So if you're a taller person, your cutting table will be taller. But it's generally a little taller than most of your like countertops, or I don't know, countertops tend to be a little higher too because that's a work surface where you may be standing a lot. But like your dining room table and things like that, even though it's got a nice big surface, you're going to have to bend over a lot more in your process because it's not as high. All right, so now I think it's pretty straightforward cutting on the lines that you've traced. So what we're going to talk about now, and this is a skinny strip, there's no point in saving it, so I'm going to cut this off so I can work with this piece. Now, like I said, some people prefer to cut the tissue paper at the exact size that they're going to be cutting. I tend to cut them both at the same time. All right. So instead of cutting on my traced lines, I'm cutting on the specific lines on the pattern paper that I'm needing. And again, I know how to eyeball these because I've been doing this for a while, but if you have you're using a multi-size pattern, it's a very, very good idea to trace that cutting line, the line you're going to be cutting on, in another color so that you can keep that straight. That's if you cut the tissue paper out before or with the fabric. One more. Now, if you notice with the pattern pieces that I traced, I did some of the tracing on that one before I pinned it together to cut it out. And the reason why is because my pattern piece was not pinned to the fabric, so the only way for me to have access to those markings was to mark it before I took my pattern piece away. This, when you're using the tissue paper, I tend to cut the piece out and then I'll go back and do my marking. All right. So now I've cut out my piece with my tissue. I've got this dart that I need to mark, and I've also got notches to mark. So I'm gonna leave as much of the pins in as I can so that, again, it's nice and true. So I'm just gonna move enough to access the part of the garment I need to trace. Now, one of the advantages of using the tissue paper is I can actually sandwich my fabric inside the colored sides of my tissue paper, and I can actually mark both sides at once. Instead of marking and pulling it away and then going back to mark the other side. Now, I say that's the advantage. Sometimes, especially if your fabric is really thick, it may not transfer onto the other side in one go like this. So you'll always need to double check to make sure that it transferred to the back side as well as your front. This one did. All right, now I'm going to mark all my notches. This fabric's kind of this piece is a little overkill for this. Again, I could clip these and not have to mark them, or I could mark them with my disappearing pen on one side and then go back and mark the other side. Whatever way works for you. You just want to be careful that if you cut the notches in, that you cut right there on the shape of the notch so you're not impeding your seam allowance by cutting in further than 5/8. It's one of the reasons I like to mark them instead of cut them. Okay, so now that I have this cut and I've got it marked, I don't need this pattern piece anymore. So to keep it from kind of getting torn or getting in the way, I'm going to go ahead and take this off and put it back in my pattern envelope. Now, I talked about the importance of when you put your pattern pieces back in the envelope, making them nice and flat. Now those big sheets where we didn't cut much out of, I just fold those flat. When I have an individual pattern piece that I've already cut out, what I like to do is when I fold it up, I want to fold it so that piece, that number, is showing when it's folded. So if I go back to make this pattern again and I need to find piece 6, I don't have to unfold it to figure out which piece that is, right? I can just look at the folded piece and know which one it is. So right there, I've just got folded up, so it says, 6 front lining. So if I pull that out, I know that this is the piece I need without having to unfold it and figure that out. It's just one of those things that makes life a little easier. Okay, so I've cut these out. This one I have gotten traced on both sides. These ones I need to transfer the markings from one side to the other. Okay. So I don't know if you've been counting, but I talked to you about how we've got darts, right? There's 2 on each back piece. There's 2 on the center front, on the front, and there's 2 on the lining front. So that's 8 darts that we will be sewing. So these techniques are going to be the same no matter what you're making. You're going to have pattern pieces. You're going to be, in order to cut, when you cut your fabric out, you're going to cut it in 2 layers. And now, unless it's an asymmetrical garment, if it's an asymmetrical garment, which is something you probably wouldn't be doing for a while because that's much more advanced, then that's when you would cut out a separate right and a separate left. When you're making something symmetrical, then those 2 both get cut out at the same time, which, is a little faster, a little easier. All right. So now I was putting these, so I fold these back up, put them in the basket. Now I'm almost done. I have one more thing left to do, and that's the interfacing. Okay. Once again, we want a right and a left. The interfacing I've provided you with is a fusible interfacing, and when you feel it, there's going to be one side that feels very, very rough and the other side is smooth. The rough side, what you're feeling is little beads of glue that get activated by the heat from the iron, and that's what makes it fusible. So this piece is actually going to be pressed on to the piece of fabric that it goes with, okay? We'll fold this long ways as well, because again, we need 2 of them. And this doesn't have an actual selvage. This is much like felt, this is a non-woven piece of fabric. So it doesn't have that woven direction. It doesn't have a selvage or a grain line like a regular fabric does. But just as a matter of course, it's just easier to kind of treat it that way. Now, one of the things that's an advantage here is I know that this edge is perfectly straight. So I'm going to line it up with the edge of my interfacing, so that's one less cut I have to make. And we keep forgetting to write it on the pattern piece, but it is on your tissue pattern piece for that welt. The only 2 pieces that need interfacing are your front facing and your welt. And like I said, this doesn't actually have a grain line, so I'm just going to put it right there. Now, if you do use that edge of your interfacing for that cut edge, you do want to make sure those are lined up perfectly so that it's like you cut them together. Now, it's probably even more important to mark the interfacing pieces of these two pieces of fabric, because once this gets ironed on, it's going to kind of cover up the marks that we made before. Now, sometimes those marks show through because this is pretty thin, but we still want to mark this guy just in case. Now, this is fabric that once you're done cutting the interfacing with fusible interfacing, you want to throw those scraps away right away because you don't want them to accidentally find your way to the iron or the ironing table and have them get caught on the iron, and then you've kind of got glue everywhere. And then that's a mess you don't really want to clean up. At least I don't. Again, we're trying to be precise and cut right on the line. See, I did pick that up to move it, but when I'm cutting, I'm making sure that piece is nice and flat. Our interfacing. Let's get that marked. First, I need to do this. I did not mark my 3/8 seam allowance before I pulled that away, and then my pins were in the way, so I had to move those. So that's what that was just about. And when I folded this, I folded the glue side together so that my markings are on the what would be the right side, because once the glue side is what's going to be facing the fabric and get glued down. So this is what we're going to see once that's all done. Okay, so that is cutting our pattern. All right, so when we're all said and done, we'll have 2 backs cut on the fold. We'll have, if you're, we'll set this aside for now, you'll have 2 belt pieces. They've been cut together. And you'll have your front lining piece cut out. This is what you'll have. You have 2 of those, obviously. 2 of the, that's what you'll have cut out of the lining. If you're doing the real pocket, you will also have a pocket lining cut. You will have your front facing cut out of the fashion fabric. You will have your welt for either the real pocket or the fake pocket. And then you'll have the 2 full front vest pieces that will have the darts mark and either the welt pocket or the false welt marked. And then lastly, you'll have your inner facing of your front facing piece and your welt. So those are all the pattern pieces that you will have to have cut out to make this vest. And we've marked both sides. And so the next step is going to be to put our inner facing on. We will have a couple of thread marking things to do so we can transfer some of these marks that are on the inside to the outside. And after that, we'll start our vest construction. Thank you very much.